Well, let's finish today's lesson by talking about how Jesus led his group. Let's remind ourselves once again, disciple making is moving people toward Christ by imparting biblical truth in the context of caring relationships. And we're going to see this. This is exactly what Jesus did with his group of 12 disciples. So Jesus led his discipleship group, his life group, his small group, whatever you call it. Jesus led it. He started it by inviting a few guys to follow him. Let's take a look at the Gospel of John, John chapter 1. It says this, some disciples turned to follow Jesus, and Jesus turned to them and saw them following, and he said to them, "What are you seeking?" And then he said to them, "Come and you will see." What a simple invitation. They didn't really know exactly what they were getting into. He just invited them to follow. And later on, it says the next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee, and he found Philip, and he said to him, "Follow me." So we see that Jesus just simply started by inviting a few people to follow him. As we continue to read through the Gospel of John, we saw that he teaches them truth. He spends a lot of time teaching them truth. Let's just show you a couple examples. In John chapter 17, in verse 8, he says, in his prayer to the Father, he says, "For I have given them the words that you gave me." And then later on in verse 17, he says, "Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth." One of your homework assignments before next week is to read John, the Gospel of John, and notice how Jesus taught truth in the context of a loving relationship. We see it all over the place in there. Now, he did this in this caring relationship context. Again, let's take a look. John chapter 15, verses 9 and 13 says there in verse 9, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love." You know, what's interesting here is we see that Jesus was already in a group. He was in a group with the Father. The Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The Trinity is the eternal small group. God is a relational God, and that's why he wants us to be in relationship, because we were created in his image. And so he's saying this. He says, "I loved you, and the Father loved me too, and you should love one another." He says in verse 13, "Greater love is no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." Jesus is about to go do that. So even in the context of the cross, he's saying, I do this because I care about you, because I love you. He says later on in John 17, verse 9, he's prays to the Father. He says, "I'm praying for them. I'm not praying for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours." We told you in the last video that you should pray for the people in your group, and we see that Jesus shows us exactly how to do that. He prays for his disciples. He spent a lot of time in prayer, and I bet you a lot of it was praying for his small group, his disciples. He says in verse 12, "While I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you have given me." And then look what he says, "I have guarded them." You know, we see this pastoral care, this caring relationship that Jesus had for his disciples and with his disciples. So I want to point out that Jesus led his group for only 3 years, but it totally changed the world. It changed his disciples. It changed the world. And this is something you need to consider for your own life, for your church, that if you can do this, if you can move people toward Christ by imparting biblical truth in the context of caring relationships, it won't just change your life, it won't just change the life of the group members, but really, ultimately, it has the potential to change the world. It did for Jesus in his small group. Now, why don't you hit pause right now and talk about this with your coach, all of this stuff in red, talk it over. Don't forget, you've got a little homework for next week, and we'll see you next week as we continue on in our leader training series.